Hey everyone, today's video is going to be a little bit different. This is going to be a part 1 of a tutorial series of how I customize my figures from beginning to end, step by step. And since I've received so many comments and questions on how I take my figures apart, this video is going to be exactly that. How to prep your figures for painting, going from separating my figures to priming them. This is what you'll need for today's video. And everything I'm using in this series, besides a pot of water, is available in the description below, so check that out during the video. And again, this video is part 1 of a series, so be sure to subscribe so you know when the next one's going to come out. Today I'm using a bootleg Super Saiyan Goku that can't really stand up on its own. If this is your first time painting a figure, I'd recommend getting something cheap or something you don't mind messing up. So let's go take it apart. The first step is to boil water in a pot big enough to immerse your figure. The purpose of doing this is to soften the plastic and the glue to be able to separate the pieces. I placed this steamer insert at the bottom to protect the figure against the bottom of the pot, which still may be extra hot from the heat source. When you place your figure in, make sure the water is hot, but make sure the heat source is off. Keep the figure in the water for at least 4 to 5 minutes, and when the figure is super bendy, it's ready for your first attempt at pulling it apart. The figure will be hot, so I do recommend wearing gloves when doing this. Typically I start with the head like this, and basically keep taking whatever part comes off easiest first. Figures like these separate where there's a different color, like the skin sections, belts, shirts, and boots, so that's a pretty good indicator of where to take them apart. Usually with bootlegs, the glue is a little bit weaker, so the pieces come apart pretty easily. If you do have a piece that's not really coming off, you can reheat the water and stick those pieces back in and keep trying again. Sometimes there are some stubborn pieces that have a ton of glue and don't come off, so I either give up and paint around them later, or sometimes I stick an X-Acto knife into the joint and try to cut the piece out around the glue. But that's up to you and your comfort level. While the figure is still flexible like this, you can also reshape its position to a limited degree. I noticed that this Goku couldn't stand on its own because his legs were a little bit too close together. So while it was still flexible, I shoved this in between his legs to keep it at the position that I wanted it in, and I stuck it in the freezer to cool the plastic. And once it's completely cool, the legs should stay in its position. Every time after I take a figure apart, I test out whether or not the pieces go back together easily, and if it doesn't, chances are that it's the glue from its original assembly that's hardened and it's in the way. So I use an X-Acto knife to cut off the old glue. I'm using a number 17 chisel blade here, but a regular number 11 blade also works. Make sure you're using a sharp blade. That'll make cutting through the glue and plastic a lot easier and preventing any accidental cuts by overexerting yourself. Once you clean up all the joints, it's prime time. I'm using these alligator clips to clip onto any joints that won't be visible on the final product. I also have a piece of clay on a few of these clips to stick onto pieces that don't have joints to clip on. These clips are also a lifesaver for letting primers or your paint dry. Speaking of primers, today I'm using Army Painter Spray primers in white and demonic yellow. It's really cold in my garage right now, so these cans are ice cold, and I want them to be at least room temperature so that the primer comes out smoothly instead of in clumps. So to warm them up, I stuck them in some warm water for a bit and gave them a shake every minute or so to make sure that all the primer gets to room temperature. Every time you shake it, you'll feel in the can if any of the primer is still cold. So once you shake it and all of it's warm, you're good to go. Moving to the spray booth. Before I get started, I always use some gloves and a P95 respirator mask to prevent me from breathing in any of the particles that the spray booth doesn't capture. And if you don't want to spend the money on a spray booth, you can also spray these primers outside, or you can just buy some primer that you can hand paint on instead. The purpose of the primer is to create a smooth, uniform surface that enhances the adhesion of the top coat and provides a foundation for consistent color application. For the skin and blue sections, I'm using white primer. Paints are actually a bit translucent, so the color of the primer can have a subtle effect on the final shade of the paint color. We're going to paint Goku in his manga colors later on, and he's Super Saiyan, so a brighter, glowier look would suit him best, which is why I'm using white. If you have something with deeper shadows or a lot of texture, like fur for example, I would definitely go with a black primer instead. And I'm applying a very thin coat of primer here. If I wanted to completely change the color of the clothing, I would take several passes to make sure the primer completely covers the clothing. But since we're just refreshing the colors, a thin layer is sufficient to get that good adhesion. I think it really makes a big difference applying the primer. You can get away with not priming certain colors, but it does scratch off quite easily depending on the plastic, and you'd have to use more coats of paint in the end, so I think this prep is worth it. I'm using yellow primer on Goku's hair and his orange gi to give myself a head start, since yellow and orange paints typically have terrible coverage, and trying to get a vibrant yellow from white or black primer can take tons of coats of paint. If you don't want to buy yellow primer, I would definitely start with the light colored or white primer for anything you want to paint yellow or orange. Once I finish priming this last part, I'm all done with the prep, and all I had to do is just let this dry overnight. I hope you all found this helpful. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and make sure you check the description for everything I use in this video. And thank you to all my members who support this channel directly. Check out part 2 when it comes out. I'll start going over mixing your paints and hand painting your figure. Be sure to check out my other projects on the channel, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for watching. See you next time.